visitor to these islands has with more appreciation than Mrs. Roosevelt when she came to Britain. The King and Queen were at Paddington Station to greet her in the name of the people of Britain as she arrived in London. Admiral Stark and General Eisenhower were among friends on the platform, and after the presentations, Mrs. Roosevelt drove with the King and Queen to Buckingham Palace, where she was their guest for the early part of her stay. The next day was a busy one for America's First Lady. A press meeting at the American Embassy was her first appointment, but before leaving, she got on good terms with a London bobby. Later, Mrs. Roosevelt visited the city of London, again with the King and Queen. They went to St. Paul's Cathedral, which, although damaged inside by German bombs, still stands majestically erect in the center of the battered city. While they were there, a plaque was unveiled to Pilot Officer Fisk, the first American to lose his life while serving with the Royal Air Force. On to Stepney and those other parts of London's East End which have suffered cruelly from some of the worst bombing in the Blitz. It was a happy moment for Mrs. Roosevelt when some American soldiers greeted her with an impromptu guard of honor. Everywhere she went, Londoners turned out to welcome her. She was apparently tireless. After visiting the Corporation of London offices, she went on to the badly damaged Guildhall, and from there to tea at the Mansion House. On another day, fellow Americans at the Washington Club gave her a big welcome. This club, run by the American Red Cross, is doing a grand job of work in providing entertainment and relaxation for American troops on leave. Many clubs like this have opened all over the country, clubs in which American soldiers and sailors can meet their friends from the States. Men and women of the Air Transport Auxiliary turned out smartly on parade when Mrs. Roosevelt, accompanied this time by Mrs. Churchill, visited one of their bases. These are the pilots who ferry planes from factory to RAF. She had a few words to say to them, too.
I'm very grateful for the welcome which you've extended, and very grateful for the opportunity to learn, which is my real reason for coming to this country. I've come to see and to learn. I apologize to all of you whom I have made stand in the rain this morning. I think it must have been a very disagreeable experience. But having lived a long while, because I've spent 3 years at school in England, I know that it's not an unusual one. And the more I can see and the more I can learn, the more useful I hope to be when I get home. Thank you very much for your welcome, and I know that the President would want me to greet you for him and to say that while he wishes very much that he could see with his own eyes, he hopes that I will be able to bring him some of the information that he would like to have. Thank you.
Visiting an ATS station with Colonel Ovita Hobby, director of the WAACs, she saw what some of Britain's women in uniform are doing. This service has been doing valuable work with the British Army for over 4 years. Its members not only saw active service in France, but are now serving in Egypt and other parts of the world. Back to London, this time to the headquarters of the Fire Brigade. After watching a parade which covered most of the training these men and women undergo as firemen and firewomen, Mrs. Roosevelt saw much of the damage caused by the big fire raid on the city on December the 29th, 1940. Later, the same day, she was greeted by Air Chief Marshal Sir Sholto Douglas when she visited a fighter command station. Here she met members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and before leaving signed the visitor's book. On October the 29th, Mrs. Roosevelt went to an American reconnaissance unit commanded by her son, Colonel Elliot Roosevelt. Her visit to Canterbury came just before a savage reprisal raid by the Germans on the most famous cathedral town in England. Once again, accompanied by Mrs. Churchill, our distinguished guest visited a women's institute at Barham, also in Kent. The village had its finest local produce on show, and a pig, whose name was Franklin, and a hare called Eleanor were among those introduced. Granny Robbins, at 81, has knitted 23 jumpers and 23 wool helmets during the war. Britain's frontline town, Dover, was next in the tour. With only 21 miles of sea separating it from German-occupied France, Dover has had no respite from shelling by long-range guns and continuous raiding by Nazi aircraft. But the people of Dover still carry on. On November the 2nd, just before General Eisenhower launched his great campaign, Mrs. Roosevelt spent some time with American paratroops. Many of them may have taken part in the great North African landing, when after the longest non-stop journey ever taken by airborne troops, they went straight into action. As they passed the President's wife in review, they made a fine impression, amply confirmed by their later successes. Then back to London, this time to the Ministry of Food, where she was met by Lord Woolton. Britain's Minister for Food showed her a display of a typical week's ration on Britain's wartime diet.